Okay, everybody, thanks for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John Andrews, but as always, you can just call me PJ. Well, today with me I have Rohan Ghostwind, who's a writer here on Substack. He writes the Brackish Waters, Barren Soil Substack. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yep, Brackish Waters, Barren Soil. He covers a lot of interesting different topics here. He's somebody who he really only it feels like the last couple of months you started writing, you're already blowing up and getting a lot of interesting takes and a lot of interesting different writing. So Rohan, thanks for coming on. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of the thing that you do here?
Yeah. Well, before we even get into that, I just wanted to on air praise your writing. There's some people that when I read their work, I find it entertaining. There's some people where I read it and I find it, I'm learning something, but I feel like you, along with a couple of other people, it's like, I almost feel like you have this weirdly parallel life in the way that you think about things. And, you kind of come to the same conclusions. It's almost like, whatever's kind of going on in society, you're kind of thinking about things the same way that I'm thinking about it. And it seems like you've kind of read some of the same works, which I'm sure we can get into a little bit later on in the podcast. So I just wanted to kind of praise you for that because, I wanted to say, when I was a few months ago, I was a little bit in a bad state in terms of I was a little bit physically injured and had to spend a lot of time in the hospital. So I kind of binged a lot of your articles, and especially some of the ones where, you're talking about Kanye West, and recently you were talking about that guy in the hair metal band. And you have this really great style where I almost think of it like a Trojan horse style, where you take a pop culture issue and, on the surface, it's about, an episode of a TV show or a band or a music artist. And then you kind of smuggle in this very deep theme of, social alienation, or a system that values only profits, or something where, we all feel like we're collateral damage to, the forces of kind of greater technological forces or greater people and stuff like that. It's something that, I feel like you and I kind of have the same underlying mentality, but we kind of go about things differently. So I wanted to praise you for that. Now, to answer your question,
thank you so much, man. That's such a high compliment coming from you. So yeah, finish up. Yeah, I feel the same way. Mutual friend and friend of the show, Ancient Problems. I've said to him, we're not always on the same page, but I think we're pretty much always in the same book. And I feel like that's kind of how we are as well. So I really appreciate that, man. That's a very high praise.
Yeah, because honestly, you feel like a more dignified version of me. I like to go about things like a crotchety old man, and I just, sometimes I just shake my fist at a certain group of people. And if you've read my stuff, you know that, I have no problem kind of pissing off entire communities of Substack, which, you don't do that. But I think, underlying there's kind of a parallel there. But yeah, no, to answer your question, my background's pretty boring, a typical salary guy. And I think this is something that, you and I can discuss as well. But I think that we have this similar thing where, we work in tech nominally, but it's not like the flashy Silicon Valley type of stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if you've kind of delved into your actual work background, but I feel like there's kind of a similarity there in the sense that, I kind of do the same thing, sort of a tech nerd. It's something that pays the bills. It's not something that, maybe I'm misreading you, but it's not a passion or anything. It's just something that we kind of do to kind of, make ends meet. And
for me, it was a relatively low bar to entry for a relatively high salary at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And it was similar for me. I was kind of a business guy starting off, believe it or not, kind of one of those Wall Street types. And I just hated the culture, right? I hated the people that I was around. I just wasn't one of those work hard, play hard kind of guys. And it was just one of those things where, I'm looking around and I'm seeing people who are willing to do cocaine and Adderall just to stay up, just to fill out some fucking Excel reports and all that. And I'm like, guys, you guys are insane, right? Like me with my 1 cup of coffee a day and my 8 hours of sleep, I knew that I was never gonna sort of compete in this environment. And so like it was just something where I switched into tech because it was kind of a way for me to kind of exercise that technical skill. And also it was just a way more chill environment, like you said, for kind of a salary. So that was kind of my background. And then, around the election time, I had some thoughts in my head. So that's why, literally in the course of like, I would say 10 minutes, I just like set up my Substack and everything, didn't think it like whatever the first name popped into my head for my username, email or newsletter, all that stuff, like literally just whatever the first thing was, I just kind of rolled with it. And then the rest is kind of history. I just started writing stuff and people started following along.
Well, that's it's funny that you say and I really want to dig into the tech world too, because it's I'm kind of the same way. Like it was just a way to pay the bills at the time. I was working as a chef for a long time actually, and I had the opportunity to get like some free tech training, and then just I was off to the races. But it is very funny. Like it's like, oh, I went to like the chill, slow paced world of tech, but I mean compared to the Wall Street thing, that's a very funny transition.
Yeah, and it's just it kind of relates to something that I've been thinking about lately a lot, especially in the last couple of posts, where the tech world kind of mirrors the finance world in the sense that it's very dynamic, it's very changing. There's this kind of ethos. It tracks kind of a certain personality, and I've never been like that. It's always and we can get into this, but like I think some of your previous work is kind of talking about the Unabomber and his manifesto and all that stuff. And obviously I think I can speak for the both of us here where we don't condone his methods or even his ideology, but like there's an underlying thing where we can relate to the alienation. And it's not an alienation of like, we have enemies at the door. It's not an alienation of like, this person needs to be stopped. Like, it's not an alienation where like, we got to pick up a gun and fight some sort of like war or anything like that. It's just the fact that, you open your door, there's kind of an envelope there. You're like, ah, shit. All right, I got to pay something like a new fee. Like it's 1,000 mundane things that kind of slowly drain your spirits. And so when you read a guy like Kaczynski, it's just like, oh, he's kind of tapping into that same energy where it's like, sometimes you do just want to go live in a cabin in the woods because like, that you wake up the next day and like, that tree is still going to be there. That tree is not going to demand that you pay taxes. That tree is not going to like bother you, right? So, I'll leave it there. I don't know if you have some extra thoughts on that.
No, I think that's so there's a lot there and a lot I want to talk about, and I feel like maybe the best way of jumping into all this and like talking about your writing and tech and this go kind of ridiculously fast-paced but also kind of vacuous environment of like the tech and finance world is jumping in because you've written a lot about these rationalist guys, and you seem to have like this, I don't want to say hatred, but like this strong disdain for them. And you, and again, friend of the show, Ancient Problems, talk a lot about like these Ezra Kleins, Eliezer Yudikowsky, Scott Alexander, some of these people. And I hadn't actually really like heard of these people too much before like you and Ancient started writing about them. But you're doing, I think, very interesting, I don't necessarily say takedowns, but like, deconstructions of their ideology. So what led you to that? Because it is, once I started reading them, like you said you weren't necessarily in the super fast paced side of it, but I have done like one or two startups, and funny enough, I did a fintech startup that was not a good experience. But I saw that personality type over and over again that you see, like, it's that I guess if you're in the technical world, you get used to simple input output and you think everything works like a Linux kernel. And I think that leads to some very, disconnected from reality worldviews that I see reflected in some of these guys. So what led you to these guys? Like, were you ever a part of that world? Are you like an apostate, or you just like found out about them and don't care for them and think it's symbolic of something?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I was ever part of that group. I think I have friends who are adjacent to that group where, they would occasionally send me articles, or, I would see that part of Substack every so often. One of the things that I guess where I had a strong aversion for them is that, I kind of used to be a personal trainer at a gym, another thing that I share with Mr. Ancient Problems, but I was a lot less successful because I'm a very I don't want to say a blunt person, but the way that I speak is very, very boring. And one of the things that you realize when you need to sell things to people is that you need to dress it up in a sort of language, right? You can't just say, look, we're going to add a little bit of weight on the bar and then you're going to build some muscle, right? You have to use these like fancy sounding terms to make it seem like you're very smart, where it's like, we're going to, use daily undulating periodization rep schemes to activate sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, during your block periodization cycle. Or, if we're going to get you on a diet that's, this 12-12 paleo intermittent fasting protocol. And it's like, what the fuck does that mean? It's like, okay, well, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, intermittent fasting. So what, you're just skipping breakfast? It's like, that's really what it boils down to, right? So it's like, you need to kind of razzle dazzle people with like very fancy sounding vocabulary. It's another thing that I noticed with the finance world, where a lot of the, aesthetic of the finance world is to say very fancy sounding things about like, your trading position. Okay, I'm long on tech and short on, gold right now, but I'm going to swap my positions every quarter based on the market cap of, the S&P 490 or whatever it is, right? So you go like, but again, if you just break it down, it sounds a lot less fancy than it actually is, right? I mention all of this because when I hear someone using extremely technical / obscure sounding terminology, my brain immediately kind of rings an alarm bell. I'm like, this person is kind of grifting to me. And it's something where, I see that a lot with these online self-help guys, like Jordan Peterson or like, an Eric Weinstein. I don't know if you follow these guys, but like,
I know of them, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways that they kind of peddle their stuff is to use these very, they'll combine like finance with evolutionary biology with like some passage from God, all in the same sentence, to kind of like make it seem that they're this extremely profound person. And so tying it back to your question is like, when I read a lot of rationalist writing, it's very much in that same vein, where it's like, a lot of words that sound really good on the Scrabble board and get you a lot of points there. But when you kind of break it down, these are kind of lessons that you probably should have learned if you were socialized correctly. And to your point, where a lot of these people are disproportionately technical people, there are a lot of coders, there are a lot of like STEM grad type guys, and they, essentially use that vocabulary to reinvent things that are kind of
Basic, yeah.
basic
Or intuitive.
Yeah. If you were like a humanities guy, or like, if you just went to church every so often, I think like you would imbibe some of the same lessons. So that was kind of my like foray into kind of writing that lane of article.
Well, this is maybe a strange comparison, but at any time in your life, have you ever worked in the food service industry?
No, never.
Okay. Well, so there's and maybe if this doesn't track at all, I'm sorry, but so I used to be a chef, and now like, I love to cook. It's one of my hobbies. I do sometimes be food posting on this timeline at Substack. But there is this this food blog website called it's Food Lab, and the guy who runs its name is Kenji Lopez Alt, and he does like, it's like, the heckin' science approach to cooking, where it's a similar thing where he uses like very technical terms. You have to, when you're searing food, you have to have the Maillard reaction and high salinization and water when you're cooking pasta. It's like, oh, so you need to sear and brown meat and put salt in the pasta water. Brilliant. Like, you're using these like very that you've probably, you're online enough, the heckin' science kind of, I fucking love science people,
Yeah.
this complicated sounding terminology to describe things that are intuitive to like any line cook who has worked on, in a restaurant for a year, or the average grandma. And that's kind of part of what I like about your work, is you're kind of pulling the veneer off on some of this stuff. Since I worked in the tech world. I did a couple startups. Right now I don't know, that world just wasn't for me. Right now I'm just like a system admin type of guy at a small company, and it's pretty chill. It's not quite as much money, but it's also, I don't have to do any daily stand-ups or talk about KPIs, and I talk about how we can work Kubernetes into our workflow to blah blah blah, the same bullshit. To say all that, to say like very simple, intuitive things to describe things that are pretty banal, or I think common sense, which it's something that I see a lot. And I remember one time when I was at one of my last positions, it was like I was in a development position, and we were all talking about like, oh, AI and automation, how are we going to use this? And we were just, it was again like kind of a pointless meeting that wasted time and money. People talk, oh, how do you do this in your home projects? And there's this guy, very very nice guy actually, but that very and I don't say this like punitively, but like that very like autistic coder brain type guy, very sweet guy if you can get on his wavelength. But it's like he's like, I have my home, and I have all of these ambient temperature sensors, and if I if it dips below or above a certain temperature, I have like an automated script that I wrote to like change the temperature and stuff, and all this really cool and like really intricately like stuff that he designed. But it's like, dude, or you could just walk into the room and notice, oh, it's a little hot, a little cold. You could turn it up or down. Which is to say, I think I see a lot of these guys who have that same approach of an overly technical approach that sounds really cool and really impressive, but a lot of it is either like very disconnected from reality, or I think a lot of stuff that's very intuitive. So all that to say, can you, I still don't understand it. Can you explain what the hell shrimp welfare is to me? Because I hear people talking about that in this context.
Yeah. I mean, so are you aware of like the whole morality of utilitarianism?
Essentially my understanding is like, whatever is the most logical and most efficient way to achieve maximum happiness for the maximum amount of people, more or less. Is that right?
Yeah. And basically, like, without getting too into the weeds of the jargon, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I don't take a lot of philosophers seriously, because like they're kind of like rationalists on crack, where they love the definitions of words, and so it just becomes a game of like etymology and epistemology and all that stuff, completely devoid of any sort of practical considerations. But coming back to utilitarianism, it's basically a gigantic pros and cons list, right? So effectively what you try to do is look at the things in the world, try to quantify the pros of that thing, try to quantify the cons of that thing, and then say like, okay, you try to do the thing that has the maximum value when you take the pros and then subtract the cons, right? It's very finance brain. It's like, take the assets minus liabilities, that kind of thing. And so when they do that sort of calculation, they find that, shrimp welfare, because of the sheer number of shrimp and then sort of like their shrimp nervous systems, they comprise a disproportionate percentage of suffering on this planet, right? Now, I don't think that they're necessarily wrong. Like, I don't think that, it's like, sure, you don't have to dismiss that sort of line of reasoning outright. I think it's worth exploring, like maybe get 5 to 10 people, who are kind of smart, who care about this thing, to kind of look into it. I just think the degree to which they, use that brain of like quantification and then try to say, okay, this is objectively like the most important thing that people should be focusing on. That's kind of where I draw the line. Like, there's only a couple people where, if they told me they have the science of consciousness down to like an actual mathematical formula, that I would believe them. And that's like guys like Carlton Friston. He's like a very famous like neuroscientist, right? Maybe someone like Robert Sapolsky or someone like that. These are extremely smart people, but like, I don't know. I think a lot of the shrimp welfare stuff is just a lot of like hypothetical navel gazing. And that's why I kind of wrote this one article where, you know, it was provocatively, you know, entitled, you know, would these utilitarians kind of cop to sleeping with their own family members if it meant that you saved a functionally infinite number of shrimp? And the thing that I was trying to get at there was, it wasn't necessarily whether they were wrong. It was just that, you know, they want everyone to go against their moral intuitions and focus on shrimp welfare based on this kind of pros and cons calculation. And I said, look, here's a pros and cons list. The pro is that you save a functionally infinite number of shrimp. And the cons is that you're going to have to do something disgusting with your family member. And surprise, surprise, nobody responded, right? There was one guy who I didn't know, but everyone else, you know, they went about their day and it was dead silence, right? And so it kind of revealed to me that this is all just hypothetical navel gazing. Like it's all something that, you know, they want to sound impressive on Substack with their posts, and you know, really it's not something that they're willing to stand by.
Yeah, well, it seems like a lot of kind of pointless moral posturing too, of like, it's maybe kind of related. I don't know if you saw it. I forget who. It's like some like right-wing influencer guys like, you know, I would kill every chimp on earth to save one human. Somebody replied like, would you give one monkey a hand job? Like, you know, logically, I mean, I think like logically that's what you would do, but I mean, then you have to, oh well, that's not the point of it. The point of it is to show like, you know, I'm, you know, either like, you know, look how logical and rational I am to, you know, what we need to save these shrimp because of, you know, the total suffering versus, you know, I want to be tough and show like, yeah, I would kill monkeys just, you know, because I guess fuck monkeys, I guess, to show how tough you are. But I think it's an interesting, I think it's, how do we say? It's very descriptive of this whole mindset and like the tech and finance world, because I've been in both a little bit, and it just feels so disconnected from reality. And I'm wondering what your experience was, because my example I have is I won't, you know, say too specifically for anonymity purposes, but I worked at a fintech startup a couple years back, and it was creating this product that, like, I wouldn't say was completely useless, but it was kind of a niche of a niche of a niche type thing. And I left a while back. I kind of wrote about. I had kind of a crash around that time, crash out as the kids are saying. I think it might have failed at this point, but that's something I see a lot in the tech world and the finance world. Like there's a lot of, I feel like, false value that is created and things that sound really great on paper, but really I don't think create a lot of value. And it feels like it's just one big bubble that is getting ready to burst. You know, for every Google or Amazon, what have you, there are, you know, orders of magnitude more failed startups that have never really been profitable. Like I've, you know, kind of looked into a little bit, like in the aggregate, like tech is not profitable. The vast majority of these businesses fail. And it's kind of kept afloat by a handful of really, really big, really, really profitable businesses or products, but the vast majority of it is, you know, it's just kind of moving ones and zeros around. So I guess I'm curious to your thoughts on that, having worked in both worlds. Also, you know, it's maybe a big topic, but, you know, vis-a-vis all the talk about AI from, like, you know, even the beginning of this year, these rationalist people were like, had almost religious language around it, like, oh, it's either going to save everything or doom everything. And now in like the last month, I see people walking it back a little bit. So what are your thoughts or, you know, experiences on some of that?
Yeah, got many thoughts on it. I agree with you. Like, I think if you look at the stock market right now, it's pretty much been stagnant for the bottom 490 companies, right? If you look at the last 4 years, the growth has been quite minimal. The thing that is driving the vast majority of the innovation, the vast majority of the growth, is the top 10 companies, which are pretty much all tech sector companies, right? There's nothing in there that is not tech. And within that growth is a lot of speculation. It's a lot of things that haven't actually materialized right now, right? Because when you look at the, quote unquote AI and these large language models, it's like, what can the average person actually see? It's like, well, they have a new app on their phone, and that app is like a chatbot, and it's cool. Like, I like the chatbot. I think it creates, I was up late at night yesterday, and I'm like, all right, create a picture of Batman, but he's like in a medieval armor, and he's in front of like a Gothic castle. Okay, now create another picture of Batman, and he's in like medieval Japan, right? So it's like that part's cool, but there is definitely a discrepancy between the way that they talk about it in these sort of religious terms and what we actually see in our real life. But to your broader point, have you heard of the term technical debt?
Technical debt?
Yeah.
No, I haven't.
So it's like a software term. And the reason I'm explaining it is that I think this kind of orients myself around my experience with tech. And it's this idea that, when you're programming a solution, you're trying to come up with a new feature or trying to actually solve a problem, you can do it in one of two ways. You can do the, long-term sustainable solution where it solves a problem and then it actually creates a better experience for the user. Or you can do what most people do, which is kind of maximize for the profits in the current quarter. So you force your dev team to kind of create this hasty solution that will solve the one problem right now and then create a whole bunch of problems down the line. And one of my continual frustrations is that when I'm dealing with stakeholders or people from like the managerial class, I keep trying to tell them, I'm like, look, yes, you will solve this problem right now, but you're going to create 5 more problems down the line because you're effectively trying to create like a house made of like cardboard. So then, eventually what happens is when you're working on a code base, eventually it becomes this like gigantic mishmash, this like absolute Frankenstein of like different people creating solutions at different times. And it's just this ugly mess, this terrible, spaghetti monster of coding and technical solutions. And one of my continual frustrations, no matter where I went, big company, small company, whether it was healthcare or banking or retail or, in the entertainment aspect, is that no one would take the time to just pause and think, okay, maybe instead of trying to solve problems that nobody is asking for to get solved, why don't we go back and fix some of this? Because eventually you're building, a house of straw, and then something's going to come along and completely fail. And I think there's kind of a parallel that we're seeing between tech and this broader social trend where these tech people, they're talking about going to Mars, they're talking about building the AI machine god. And meanwhile, there's an entire swath of society right now acting like, hey, I don't know if I'm going to have healthcare next year. I don't know if I'm going to have a job, or, my job just got outsourced to some guy from China and India, right? So it's funny. There's this weird parallel between the actual coding part and what I see in society, where it's like, we're creating a society, and I say this with no actual judgment, but we're creating a society of more and more losers, where more and more people feel like they can't even get onto the social ladder. They can't even if life was kind of like a video game, or like in the West, the levels would kind of go something along the lines of like level 1, go to school, level 2, go to like, I don't know, some technical school or university, level 3, house, job, wife, kids, all that stuff. And then maybe level 4, get some career stability, right? So there's kind of a career progression, this life progression. And I feel like more and more people just want to hit the pause button on society so that, they can actually kind of start playing, right? I feel like so many people are stuck on like tutorial mode, right? And so it kind of makes me sad because I feel like, it's something that's very obvious if you look at it. Like if you, I don't want to reference like, the stuff that's happening this week, but, you look at some of these social trends, and what I see is, regardless of whether it's left wing or right wing, they're all kind of manifestations of the same basic problem, where it's like there's an alienation and more people feel like they're not actually part of society. And it kind of made me sad because, you know, I was reading an article where I think just a couple days ago where they were talking about how there's potentially life on Mars now. And, you know, they found this sort of geological formation that very, very strongly shows that, you know, if that formation was on Earth, it would almost be guaranteed that it was like a bacterial sort of thing that, you know, happened. I don't know much about the science there, but the top comment on that post was like, that's great, but I still got bills to pay. You know, none of that changes my personal life, right? And so I think that's kind of the prevailing sentiment, that kind of underlying alienation. Anyways, that was a long monologue. I don't know if you have any thoughts there.
No, for sure. It's as I often say, like, this podcast is for the ADHD community. So a couple different things I wanted to jump off on there, and that's how do I want to put this? With regards to AI, it's one of those things that I feel is not really well understood. And I'm a technical person. I work in a technical field. I maybe understand it a little bit better than your average bear, but I'm not like a coder, machine learning type of person. I also sometimes feel like if you look at the way people talk about and write about AI, I kind of do a thought experiment where, like, replace, you know, control F, replace AI, and then insert angry wizard. And that's a good way, to me, it's like a good litmus test of like how well this person understands the topic, or even if they understand it from a technical perspective, like the degree to which they can conceptualize and contextualize it. You know, it might as well be like, you know, angry wizard is going to take away all jobs by 2027, you know, et cetera, you know. But that having been said, it's I can't tell from a technical perspective what the long-term effects are going to be, as far as things like, from what I understand, we're already hitting pretty hard limits as far as data center capacity, our power grid, scalability, like the degree to which like individual companies or workplaces would actually get use out of it, when it's going to be like what's profitable versus, like, you know, as I said, your data center imprint, your the power costs, like when does that stop being profitable? When is it scalable? And you were talking about like generating images of Batman. Like, my understanding is already like copyright laws are starting to catch up to a lot of these LLMs. And there's something to be said about LLMs versus, you know, for the folks at home who don't know, like large language models, which is kind of a really good Google search in a way. It's able to parse large amounts of data and make predictive text feedback based upon, you know, what makes sense in context. Machine learning is its own thing. But all that to say, like, we don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. I've read very, very smart people who are very black-pilled on it and saying it's going to be kind of a like orders of magnitude of the Industrial Revolution. Also very smart people, you know, even like, you know, Linus Torvald, creator of Linux. He's like, yeah, it's probably a little bit overhyped. It's going to have its uses. But that having been said, that's kind of a long-winded preface of, we don't know how a technology like that is going to be implemented. But I feel like something you said really resonated with me, like the way that some of these people in the tech world, the finance world, the current U.S. government are looking at it. It's just it's kind of kicking the can down the road and not really solving fundamental problems. Because, you know, say what you will, I've been researching like how China is implementing AI and leveraging and developing it. And say what you will about China, I'm not a tanky, but they are, for better or for worse, using it to reinforce social stability. You know, unfortunately, you know, a lot of, you know, in these cases, it's censorship and stuff like that. But they're using it to stabilize their society versus the stated goal. Like, a lot of these people, they're not even trying to have a buy-in of, yeah, this is why this is going to be good. It's more of like, yeah, this is going to eliminate all, like, about half of white collar work, and automate a bunch of jobs by 2030. But it'll probably work out. I saw Sam Altman saying, yeah, we'll have jobs in space or something by then. No plan on how to get from point A to point B. It's something that's like, they're I see them walking it back. I don't know if it's a case of them, over promising and under delivering, or because of the overwhelming amount of negative feedback they're getting, they're changing the branding, or if it was just like, hey, let's hype this up to put a little bit more gas in the tank of the floundering U.S. economy. But all that to say, I even like if you look at it based on what they were saying 6 months ago, it's like you're destroying a huge amount of our productive capacity, even more like social rungs for people to even not even get to the middle class, to be like barely subsistence level. So it's one of those things where, like, again, it feels like it's very indicative of that attitude of like, yeah, we're going to destroy the productive capacity and consumptive capacity of our economy, which is unfortunately a big part of our productive capacity, economically speaking, just so like a small amount of people can have more money because it says that is the correct thing to do per Adam Smith or one of these rationalist guys. And you have to wonder, like, at a certain point, like, again, I'm not a tanky, but like, all right, at what point is it this is not worth it? And yes, you could say according to the experts or whatever, like, oh, of course we have more economic, our GDP goes up, the line goes up. But at what point is this not only like destructive long term for like the economy and the productive capacity of our country, but also just like so socially corrosive that like you'd hope somebody would be like, hey, pump the brakes, but that doesn't seem to be happening.
Yeah, this kind of gets to one of the other criticisms that I had of sort of the rationalist tech person mindset, where if you kind of dig into their underlying worldview, they won't necessarily state it outright, but they have a certain superiority complex, right? These are the people who understand the AI systems, they understand machine learning, they understand the fancy math. So they kind of have this blasé attitude about how all the things are changing, because in the back of their mind, again, they won't necessarily say it this way, but it's like, oh, I am the high IQ person. I will be fine no matter what exactly happens, right? And I've kind of, it's funny, I went back and sort of, I have a journal, and I was writing some stuff, 10, maybe 11 years ago. And I was writing kind of in the same vein when people were talking about automation. And, there was a lot of deindustrialization. There was a lot of like, shifts in the workforce at that time, especially around 2008, 2012. There was a lot of like financialization where people were kind of questioning. It's like, why is it that, the only prosperous people are people that, kind of have, they work for the Department of Defense or otherwise kind of work in Wall Street, right? It seems like we're kind of over-indexing on a very small number of sectors, right? And so that was something that kind of irked me about, a lot of the tech / rationalist guys, where really it's not like, you can tell that their interest for society overall kind of is limited because they themselves see themselves on the correct side of the trade-off, right? And so one of the things that I keep harping on throughout many of my posts is like, look, it's fine if you want to sacrifice other people for the sake of your specific goals. It was something that I wrote about recently, but it's like, you can't get mad when all of a sudden other people sacrifice you for the sake of their goals, right? Like, you can't live by the sword and then all of a sudden not like refuse to die by it, so to speak, right? So that's another thing. To your point about China, they do things differently over there. I think between China and America, there's a fundamentally different mindset with fundamentally different problems, right? If you look at our government, it's pretty much all just people who have lawyer degrees, right? They kind of work in law. They understand how the law system works. And so what you get are people who are very good at documenting things, creating procedures, putting out policy, right? So it's a lot of quite frankly, just like a lot of documents with fancy words, right? And then, as certain part of the political spectrum is now noticing, it's like, documentation and then putting out, fancy, words is not enough to actually move the needle on things. You actually have to impact people's lives. With China, it's the opposite problem, where I think pretty much their entire government is filled with engineers. And it's kind of like, if the rationalists actually took over government, how would it work, right? So it would be a lot more technical. It would be a lot more authoritarian, and they would see every problem as kind of like an engineering problem, which, I mean, it's good in a certain sense because it gets things done in a small way. But then they also look at social problems the same way as an engineering problem, right? And that leads to a lot of big mistakes. You could just look at the one-child policy and see that it was kind of a big mistake to do that, because now you have like lopsided gender ratios. And then, once this current, as people continue to age, you're going to have this lopsided series of demographics there. And it kind of ties back to something you mentioned previously, where, these people, they try to create solutions, and they're very smart when it comes to their personal domains. But it's almost like we've come to idolize these tech people in a way that, they don't necessarily deserve, right? Because yes, they are very good at their particular, like, I have no doubt that Elon Musk knows a lot about, electric vehicles, but like, I think we give them an undue degree of status that isn't necessarily warranted. And you see this when they completely fail to understand the social ramifications of the stuff that they're putting out into the world, right? Like how the thing, like, things like social media, even more recently, like the, what do you call it? The ChatGPT, they had an update, and like a lot of people were depressed, right? Because they had intimate relationships with like their chatbots, and then they noticed that those chatbots had changed, right? And it was creating like these real social issues, right? And so I think they look at everything in terms of a technical problem, whereas in reality, I think we need to start thinking of things as like an ecological issue, right? So it's like, you want to get rid of the bees in the forest or whatever, and then all of a sudden you have a plague, right? It kind of creates this chain reaction, and it's kind of hard, like especially with natural problems, like problems of nature, it's hard to forecast how these things are going to play out. Like maybe you just wanted to get rid of some pesky little beavers that are kind of like messing up the local forest, right? You get rid of those beavers, and all of a sudden you have a certain type of grasshopper that's like killing everything. It just makes the whole problem worse, right? So they're very smart in a technical sense, very, very kind of stupid in a social sense. And then, not to keep bringing it back to this, but like that's kind of the thing that I kind of read in the Unabomber's manifesto, where he's talking about this very problem, and it's so weird to hear or to read about it in 30 years ago, where he's kind of forecasting the things that are happening right now. But he sort of predicted it, an entire lifetime ago, which it just makes you, or at least it makes me kind of disappointed to see how little we actually learn from all these things.
Yeah, I think a term I sometimes use for something like that is like engineer brain, where kind of like I was saying earlier, like it makes sense on a technical level, but you are so, it's a classic, like, you can't see the forest through the trees scenario, where sure, on paper, this all looks good, but you're not really seeing the practicalities of it. Like I remember like in my startup days, we do these stand-up meetings, and like we would have like security and, we were like the security networking team and IT team, and people would just get in like shouting matches over Zoom over the most banal stuff. And to me, kind of like, to loop back a little bit to what you said, like I'm, for better or for worse, I'm just not built like that. To me, it's a means to an end. If it paid better, I'd still be, I was perfectly happy to be flipping burgers. Actually, it was fun to work the grill or work the line, but I can do bad hours or bad money, not both. But it's a problem that I see over and over again. And I feel like it's very uh, unfortunately common across all these different fields. And I think maybe it's a good time now, since you brought it up, to talk about, Ted Kaczynski and the Unabomber Manifesto. And that's something that I wrote about, that like it's become, oddly enough, like a cult figure to like certain demographics and, certain maybe personality type of millennials and Gen Z. Just because a lot of it is like very, very prophetic, where he talks about concepts like surrogate activities, like where if you don't have an actual purpose and meaning in life and a place in your community, you'll create, as he describes, these surrogate activities. It could be hobbies or, political activism that try to give you that same sense of fulfillment that you would have in a more traditional society. And obviously, as you said, here on the Xanadu Review, we officially condemn the violent actions of Ted Kaczynski. That having been said, it is interestingly prophetic too. And especially like, you mentioned a second ago, the update of ChatGPT that a lot of people felt, well, it kind of, I've heard it described as like lobotomizing ChatGPT. And I use ChatGPT fairly often for work. And I sometimes use it for like research when I'm writing, because, I've heard it described as, having a really good, like grad student to help you with your research. Like for me, like, okay, I read this book 2 years ago. I want to talk about it in this article. I don't want to have to reread the whole thing. ChatGPT, look up what chapter this part was talked about it, and I can read this specific chapter. But you have to actually read the book. I wrote about that one time, because it will just straight up lie, or I guess hallucinate, as they say. And I think you could end up looking pretty silly if you haven't actually read the book. But all that to say, like, I didn't notice a significant change between, what was it, 4.5 and 5, whatever's the most recent. But I do know some people who use it as a companion or therapy or stuff like that. That's not how I use it personally, but so I didn't really notice. But it is interesting to see, and you would wonder how, what good old Uncle Ted would have to say about the AI companionship, because on one level, like, it's kind of, you feel sad that people don't have these options for human connections. So it's, kind of like the surrogate activities thing. You're having again, back up to what you're saying, like, you've created this solution, but you're not really solving the fundamental problem of human loneliness and lack of connection. And then like a software update can feel like people losing a friend.
Yeah. And this is why I continually get frustrated with a lot of the conversations around the different supposed crises where, we're blaming the tech. And listen, I just, this entire podcast, we've been talking about how, the tech people are kind of out of step with the majority of society. But that said, blaming ChatGPT, these models and social media, it's like kind of diagnosing a person with tumors, where it's like, okay, we need to get rid of these tumors. We got to, cut them out and all that stuff. And it's like, well, what's actually creating the tumors? It's like they have cancer, right? So if you're not going to diagnose the underlying cancer, you're only going to, talk about things at the level of tumors, then, you're never going to actually solve these problems, right? And you kind of touched on one of them, where we have a lack of social trust. We have a lack of community. We have a lack of friendship. These are things where, it almost feels like we decided that, we shouldn't ever have any obligations to our friends or our family. And so now we're kind of disconnected. And so now, in order to buy that back, we get a therapist, or we, log on to BetterHelp, right? And so this is something that I was trying to convey when I was trying to talk about the fertility crisis, where I think it's a false distinction, where we talk about economics and culture as if they're two different things, right? So for example, in the 1970s, let's just say you wanted to go to the grocery store. Maybe you call up your neighbor, or like, you knock on your neighbor's door and you say, hey, can you can look after my kids for 5 to 10 minutes. I'm just going to walk over and kind of get something back. And because there was a social trust there, they'll say, yeah, sure. Like you knew your neighbors, you understood where they came from. Maybe you went to the same church, all that stuff. So then you could get these things done. And so, you didn't have to pay them. In fact, I think most people would kind of be offended if you kind of like paid them $10 just to look after your kids if you're friends, right? It's like, no, I'll look after them for free because we're friends, right? So nowadays it's like, now you want to go and spend some time with yourself. Like you kind of have to hire a nanny because you don't know your friends, like you don't know your neighbors and all that stuff, right? So that's kind of what I was trying to say when we've taken problems of culture and then turned it into problems of economics, right? And then another thing is like, there's just the degradation to the environment. Another thing that, Ted Kaczynski talked about, like just how we're destroying nature. And so a lot of the things that people, especially economists, say just don't track with me because they're, in my opinion, they're using all of the wrong measurements to kind of judge how well society is doing. It's like, yeah, of course, yeah, literacy rates are going up and GDP is growing and all that stuff. But what about things like obesity? What about the things like the number of friends? How about the number of people who are going insane and, going into public places with guns? It seems like, those things have demonstrably gotten worse. And so I just have this frustration with a certain category of pundits where they just seem not to want to acknowledge these things, or at least not to want to acknowledge them in a way that actually gets to the heart of the issue, right? Like if they're an economist, they'll look at all of this and say, no, this isn't an economics problem. This is a social problem, where it's like, no, that distinction is false. To your point about ChatGPT though, I agree. Like I didn't really notice a difference with the updates. I went in there almost immediately, like a little while ago, and because there's like system prompts where you can ask them, or you can tell the GPT how it should address you. So I was thinking, like, because I was getting tired of like these weird like dashes and emojis and all that stuff. I'm like, listen, just give me like a boring answer, right? Like tell it to me straight, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I always found it weird where people are kind of getting AI psychosis or like literally getting depressed because their ChatGPT like doesn't validate their emotions the same way that they want to, right? So I think this is more than anything, it seems to me like an extension of like parasocial relationships where people develop relationships with Twitch streamers or like online YouTubers or something like that, right? Where you're like, okay, this is not a healthy dynamic, right? This is just a crude simulation of what's going on. And I feel like, the large language models is just taking that dynamic and going one step further. That being said, I wrote an article a little while ago where I was kind of like, to give a kind of a lifting analogy, you'll see people at the gym with all of this equipment, right? They'll wear like, wrist wraps and belts and sleeves, and they'll have, a solid, $300 worth of merchandise that they'll bring with them every time they do a lift. And after a certain point, you have to ask yourself, it's like, okay, are you actually doing this exercise, or is it just the equipment that's helping you do that, right? And I think one of the bigger problems is not necessarily the technology itself, but it's almost like that, but with your mind. Like ChatGPT is adding all of this extra layers of equipment with your mind where, people are just using it to write essays for them. And to your point, right? Like you have to have read the book to know if the summary is worth its salt at all, or even like if something is hallucinating, if ChatGPT is hallucinating, like go and ask another model. Like you have to have some basic skepticism, right? Because it's not like the other model is going to hallucinate the exact same way, or that's going to be very rare, right? So it's just these very basic things of like, okay, if you want ChatGPT to do all of your thinking for you, that's fine, but it's the equivalent of like going in to a gym and like putting on 300 pounds worth of equipment or $300 worth of equipment, then doing a bench press and being like, yes, I can bench press 300 pounds. But it's like, no, you can only do that because you have like this, you're wearing like this weird lifting suit and you have all of these extra gadgets and equipments on. So it's like, it's not really you doing it at that point. So again, yeah, I just, a lot of stuff there in the monologue. You can take it however which way you want.
Yeah, no, it's I think it's a very apt way of putting it, because yeah, you do have to, at the end of the day, you do have to do the work. And kind of like I use ChatGPT for work a good amount, just because like I work with a lot of it's, it's a small business, so there's a lot of different types of technology that are used. A lot of it's like, bubble gum and paper clips, so to speak. So, all right, I'm getting this random error code for this legacy technology instead of combing through 20 pages of documentation. Like, here's the make, model, here's the error code. What's the issue? For stuff like that, it's extremely useful. Like I said, I'm like, all right, I read, for example, a while back, I did something where I was talking about the book, what was it? The Strauss Howe, I can't think of the name of the book. I'm blanking on it right now. That talks about the fourth turning. That was it. So I read that like 2 years ago. It's like, all right, I remember it talking about this. Look up this passage. I remember reading it, and I can go read that again physically. But it's funny, I've heard it, described as like, it's these LLMs are these magical tools that know everything about something you don't know about, but it's only like 60-70% there if you do know about it. Like I remember I was working with something like I was trying to create because I'll use it for like scripting stuff, because I can't really code or anything like that, but or like not to get too into the weeds, but like like PowerShell scripts or something like that. And I needed to do like a generic configuration for a Cisco switch that I could have replicated and just plug and play the information that I needed. And it's like it's getting like basic networking stuff wrong that you would know that if you've worked in that field for a year, then it's like, oh, well, that's not even close to right. So you have to, again, like it has its uses, but it has rapidly diminishing returns, and it is something that is a little bit concerning. And I'm curious to see. Sometimes I think that like we've already left the golden age of free or cheap, easily accessible LLMs. Since some people talk about how we're going to see this become ubiquitous, and it's going to take over, every aspect of society. It's going to be, I've heard it described as a technology on par with smartphones, that it's going to be, integrated into every aspect of our real life. I'm a little bit more, not quite a total skeptic, but maybe somebody more measured, because at the very least, like I was saying earlier, I wonder when this stops becoming cost effective, because even OpenAI is not profitable as of now. But all that having been said, I do think it's going to be something that sticks around, and I wonder the degree, like the effect that's going to have on society again, because the degree to which a lot of these LLMs are very obsequious and don't really challenge you. Not, and that's to say nothing of the fact that I've called it better Google, but in even there's Google has gotten much worse about this, about as far as like their search result aggregation and the information they will or won't give you. But even still, like Google is giving you a list of sites that you can go to and read yourself, and now you're trusting a third-party company to even further filter that information for you. And that's not even touching on the parasocial aspect of, it's one thing to, I like a very impersonal thing. When I use ChatGPT, I kind of experimented with naming it just because I thought it was neat, like a sci-fi aspect. It's called like Isaac, after Isaac Asimov, but I just kind of forgot about it. But I know some people who personify their LLM instances, or I've seen some of these apps where you could have like, Pikachu, I guess not Pikachu, like, whatever character from a TV show or book that you like, and you think you have these relationships. And I'm going to be interested to see how that goes. My instinct is to say that this isn't a good thing. And we're moving towards like an even more isolated and like socially malignant paradigm with some of this stuff. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that, because you've written about like and so has an author and somebody I've had on the podcast, Catherine D, has mentioned like she thinks that like like the chat bot companions are going to be like way more popular with women long term, and that makes sense to me. But I'm interested to see if this is going to be like maybe a salve for some people, but maybe like accelerating some of the most negative social trends that we're seeing right now.
Yeah. I mean, that the gendered aspect is very interesting because, obviously, like, to stereotype guys versus women, like creating like an actual sex doll is going to be it has a lot more technical problems for guys, right? Because it exists in the 3D world. I mean, I'm sure there's some people right now where they have, like, because I've seen it where, especially in the anime community, you'll have people who have like printouts of like people on like pillows and stuff, and that's become like
sentient body pillows is the future, is what you're saying?
Yeah, that is pretty fucking weird, but like, it's something that we see, and I'm sure it'll happen to some degree. But you're right, or the thing that I was writing about, and Catherine also seems to be on the same wavelength there, where it seems like the large language models, what it allows you to do is kind of create custom generated, I don't want to say like softcore porn, but it's a kind of erotica for that person specifically, right? And this is something that I've noticed. I don't want to call it like a hypocrisy, but it's something where you do see like a double standard where, there's a lot of discourse online calling guys gooners and losers and all that stuff. And it's not that I necessarily disagree, but if you go to a bookshelf on most major bookstores now, you'll see that it's a lot of like quasi erotic literature for women who, and quite frankly, the weirdest part is that it's for women that are kind of like between 10 and like 25 years old. And it just seems like very degenerate, right? And I think that, this AI chatbot stuff is kind of going to tap into that same psychology, right? Because at the end of the day, these technologies interact with men and women differently. You can see that with social media, where I think like women get a lot more depressed because of what they see on social media, right? It's a lot of like relational stuff. It's a lot of like, seeing people live these idyllic lives with perfect bodies. And I'm sure to an extent it affects guys as well. Like, there's probably someone out there like looking at Arnold Schwarzenegger getting all depressed that they'll never look like that. But, I think just because of some inherent discrepancies or differences in like psychology or even like neuroscience, it's interacting with them a lot worse. And that was one of the things that I noticed when I was looking at the loneliness statistics. If you look at an absolute level, it's 100% true that it's impacting guys more, in the sense that guys are much more likely to be friendless, not have a community, not be in touch with their family, and just generally be alienated. But it's not like women are doing much better. You see that, from 1970, let's just say if the average guy had 10 friends and the average woman had 20 friends, it's now something where it's like, the average guy has like 2 friends and a lot of them have no friends. And the average woman has now gone down to like maybe like 4 friends, and some percentage also have 0 friends, right? So it's kind of at a relative level, it's actually kind of impacting women a lot more. And it's just something where it's almost like there's a time delay where a lot of the issues that are impacting men right now seem to be on the horizon for women. And I saw that especially with the hustle bro culture, right? It seemed that, in the 2012 to 2016 era, there was a lot of like grind set, sleep 3 hours a day, deny your friends and family, just spend all day at the office and all that kind of stuff. It was a lot of, I saw a lot of memes of like, John Hamm from Mad Men, or like the guy from Suits. Like, it's a lot of like,
Sigma grind set bullshit.
Yeah, all that stupid shit. And like, it's funny because a few years later, I feel like that same mentality was then repackaged and marketed to women. It was a lot of like girl boss and kind of do your own thing, and nobody should limit your freedom and all that stuff. Coming back to your point about the LLMs and sort of forecasting it, I just want to be clear. Like, I have a background in machine learning, so I do understand the algorithms a decent amount, like the underlying math and all that stuff. But I want to be clear that I'm nowhere near smart enough to understand like what's going on at like these frontier labs. Like that's like 7 levels beyond like the depth of my technical expertise, right? If I'm playing like basketball on the side of the street, these guys are kind of like the guys in the NBA, right? So I don't want to give any sort of impression that I have any sort of authority on the matter. Like to whatever extent that I actually understand it, it's because I understand like traditional machine learning algorithms, your regressions, your classifications, a little bit of reinforcement learning stuff, which is an entirely different field of math. But to the extent that I see these systems becoming transformative, it's basically through a very simple process, right? Like, and it's funny because it's kind of once more ties back to something that was written in Uncle Ted's manifesto, which is like the power process, where these things, the way that they're kind of going about things, like these neural networks, these large language systems, is that they have to have some sort of loss function. They have to have some sort of goal that they know that, they're kind of performing, they're on the right track in terms of giving the right answer, right? So in ChatGPT, the P stands for pre-training. And that's kind of where, you're kind of giving these models the data and you're kind of giving a report card. But that report card has to be based off of something, right? It has to be based off of this thing known as like a loss function, which is just math saying like, hey, you did really well, you got an A+ on your answers, or you did really poorly, so I'm giving you an F. And so then in a very dumb process, it doesn't need anything like sentience or consciousness or anything like that. Eventually it will figure out that if you have a goal, the best way to attain that goal is to have power. And the best way to have power is to, I don't want to say manipulate people, but it's to get people in line with that power, right? Again, it doesn't require any sort of nefarious intention or anything like that. It's basically the stuff that we already see with existing algorithms with social media, right? If you maximize for engagement, what you're going to get is basically one half of the internet is porn and the other half of the internet is anger, right? It's just, how can we tap into that amygdala? How can we tap into that limbic system as much as possible so that you keep staring at the screen, right? So I don't think any coder goes in and says, okay, this is exactly what we want to do. It's just a byproduct of the way these things are programmed based on the goals that they have. So if you have an LLM and you train it with a goal, like the way that I see it becoming transformative is that, you're going to have some Wall Street traders eventually hand over, their trading strategy or, some sort of financial system over to these LLMs. And then it's just going to create this recursive cycle. Now, how that's going to manifest, the timelines, the scale of the impact, I have no idea. I think that anybody who speaks with any sort of confidence in terms of how it's going to manifest is just kind of, quite frankly, I just put them in the category of like grifter in my head. More generally, I think the issue right now with just tech in general is like, we've kind of moved away from the builder mindset of the past, right? Like, back in the day when I thought of tech, I thought of like bullet trains. I thought of trains where it's like, you can go, start off in like San Francisco and go to New York. And then one day there would be like a unified railway line that would like an hour and a half or something like that. But it seems like, everything is just this frivolous SaaS product. I think they've done quite a bunch of damage to their reputation with like the NFTs and the crypto stuff, where it's just basically all scams. And the main thing, sorry, I know I'm monologuing here, but like it's kind of the one of the things that I just kind of see that never gets solved is just the ever expansion of like bureaucracy. It just kind of makes life complicated for everyone, right? The smartphone started off as something that made our lives more convenient, but I don't know about you, but it's like, it's kind of a mandatory thing. Like you have to have a smartphone. You have to, like, now I need to use it as like just stuff to log in, right? Like
MFA and all this other stuff. And I don't think the technology has really, maybe like at the periphery, but since launch, I don't think the technology has really improved. It's something you said, it really strikes me a couple different things. Like, first of all, like the hyper-financialization of every aspect of our like our culture, our economy, and the society. Like I remember, there's a I almost hesitate to bring it up because it's such a large topic. It could be several podcasts on its own. But like one of the main reasons for the ballooning cost of American healthcare or universities for that matter is like this massive amount of administrative bloat that we see basically across the board. And it makes me think of like, in the end, the Soviet Union, there is a myriad of reasons, but one of the reasons why that contributed to the fall was like this, the communist system taken to its logical conclusion, or like at least with the worst excesses of hyper bureaucracy, and we're seeing this hyper financialization now, where I don't think it's really solving a problem it's not solving a problem. It's expanding the process and using that like, oh, there was an old web comic I saw of like two guys like, I'm going to pay you $1,000 to eat this cow shit. It's like, oh, I'm going to pay you $1,000 to eat the cow shit that I just threw up. It's like, oh, well, we created $2,000 in the GDP. It's like, well, you haven't really done anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot there, and it kind of makes me think to go back to something else we were talking about, and more broadly about the specific ways that these things are going to be implemented, and kind of the way that I feel like even you see like the way that different genders are going to interact with this stuff. I forget, maybe you were posting about it or somebody else I saw like sex is a real thing, and like the way different sexes are going to interact with technologies in a different way. It's going to have different effects on people. And it kind of makes me think of, since you mentioned Arnold, it is like, I don't feel like there's a lot of heterosexual women who find like that hyper bodybuilder thing attractive. It's kind of just like more male narcissism when you get like Arnold was a freak of nature, but because he looked good when he was that buff, but most people don't have those genetics where you get that buff, you fill out like that. I think for a lot of, when you see that hyper bodybuilder thing, it's like a balloon. It's how do I want to put this? Like with Arnold Schwarzenegger, it looks like he is, his muscles inflate evenly and aesthetically. And for other people, it's kind of asymmetrical and look kind of weird. And much in the same way, like I see like, especially, it's always been a thing, but really in the last couple of years, this strange look that women have, what's her face? Like Ariana Grande, that chick from The Boys, I think something Moriarty, and like this extremely skinny, like I again, like I say this with all care and empathy as much as possible. Look, these very anorexic looking women who wear like drag queen type makeup, and like it's like the female gaze turned inward. It's like that same level of female narcissism as we see like with male narcissism with the bodybuilder, and it just feels like a very strange phenomenon to observe, where like your move, because on paper, like I get some of the logic behind it, and that it sounds good, like you're doing it for your own self-esteem, be it the bodybuilder or these like super skinny model chicks. But at the same time, like maybe these things can't really exist in a vacuum. And obviously, like, we're talking about like top 1% of 1% here on either side. But the fact that that's aspirational, I feel, is maybe speaks to something larger about, again, kind of how a lot of these maybe good or understandable social trends have gone so far off the rails and so far away from having like any kind of embodied reality or applicability to having any kind of like social context, that it's like, it feels like this is something that, assuming society doesn't go totally tits up, there's so many things that I think we're going to look back on in future generations and be like, wow, it's like on the level of foot binding or something like that,
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things. Like there was a little there's like this picture, like this before and after picture of like some guy, he was like flexing. I don't know if you remember that. And it was just like a lot of women were like, yeah, I prefer, you know, when he was before like he lost a bunch of weight, like he got shredded and then posted after. And it was kind of like this stark reality where a lot of the guys, they, you know, they were like, yeah, like great weight loss, man. Like you look ripped, you look shredded. And then a lot of women were like, yeah, well, actually, I think the before picture looks a little bit better, right?
Yeah, I think Lorpa Strike posted something about that. I remember.
Yeah. And so it kind of ties back to what you're saying with like Arnold, where I think a lot of guys, they get this impression that you need to go to the gym 7 days a week, you know, become this absolute behemoth in order for like women to even start talking to you. Whereas in reality, it's like, you know, go for a jog, you know, do a little yoga, you know, lift some weights, obviously, like that's not going to harm you, but that can't be the only thing that, that like, you know, like, it's good to have a personality as well, right? Like you got to be able to make a woman laugh or like have something else aside from, you know, what are you going to do? You're just going to keep flexing your biceps to get women. Like it's, or like, I mean, you can do that, but you are going to get a very specific type of person who's going to be attracted to you, right? And this kind of relates to one of the articles that I see because, you know, I like that's the male version of what we're talking about, and one of the things that I kind of see is the opposite side where, like you're saying, you know, women will get like these nails, they'll get like Botox, they'll get like surgery, they'll have like these expensive handbags, and then they'll assign it to like the patriarchy. They'll be like, you know, God, like, look at what you men are making me do, like these impossible beauty standards. And I'm like, that's not like, no guy wants this. Like, you're doing this for yourself, right? And so, you know, I've written, you know, a bunch of articles just in that same basic vein where it's like, this is not, you don't abstract out these problems to some nebulous patriarchy, right? Like, because that kind of, once more, it kind of ties back to the rationalist, like grifter language, where you're using extremely abstract, complicated sounding language to explain a phenomenon that's like very mundane, which is like, you know, you're doing all of this stuff for yourself or for your particular friend group, and you're kind of abstracting it out to something like the patriarchy just to kind of avoid responsibility, right? So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that, you know, we're going to look back on this, like especially with social media, and just think to ourselves like, man, why the fuck did we allow like children to like kind of nuke their brains with all of this? And I think it kind of ties back to the fact that I think it's a very hard thing to acknowledge for most people that, you know, they're not destined for greatness, nor are they destined for some like tragedy where it's like, you know, I think a lot of people, they adopt this mantle of victimhood just because it makes them stand out, right? I think the two ends of the spectrum are like, you know, I'm the first in my class, so that makes me stand out. Or if they don't want to go that way, they'll kind of go the other way where it's like, you know, I had a sensory processing disorder and ADHD and OCD, and, you know, even me just being a regular person was a feat of strength, right? And they're both from the same place where it's like, you know, I can't accept that I'm just a mediocre person. I'm not great. I'm not horrible. I just am, you know, right at the middle of the bell curve. I feel like in that sense, it's just, for whatever reason, our society just doesn't allow for that type of person. Like it's almost like we have disdain for that person more than someone who sits on either end of the spectrum, right? So it's creating all of these disorders, right? Like mental disorders, these beauty disorders. And even like, you know, again, I think, as you're saying, like, we're going to look back on this time and just kind of think to ourselves, like, what were we thinking? I think one very, very obvious thing is just the fact that, you know, 70% of Americans at this point are either obese or overweight. And just the idea that we tolerate, you know, just the sheer amount of like sugar in our in our diets, like just this horrible way that we're like basically poisoning the majority of our society and thinking that it's like under the vein of freedom. Like I think like this is, it honestly, it just makes me quite sad, right? Like I think it's no different than the people who, they smoked in front of their kids, they smoked indoors, like a lot of people who just, smoked 4 or 5 packs a day. I'm sure that still exists right now, but like people are just more aware. And I think when I forecast this out, 5, 6 decades from now, we're going to look at, sugar the exact same way. And that's why, I never really like take I never specifically talk about, a political point on the spectrum. Like I'll never like talk about politics directly, because it's one of those things where, again, not to sound like an enlightened centrist, I'm like, I don't care whether it's a Republican or a Democrat that addresses this issue. I really don't give a fuck. Like whoever on whatever side of the spectrum, has the balls to say like, look, we are getting really fat and this is creating a big problem, I will support that person. I really don't care.
Mhm.
Right? That's why, like, I really like put my foot down one way or the other, because I just don't care who it is that talks about these things. Anyways, another long monologue. If you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess there's a couple things that immediately stand out to me. And first of all, like it was, it's one of those things where, again, like you're not really, there's a lot of good like identifying of the problem. Like I don't even put like, right, left on it. But I remember years back, there was, Jon Stewart did America, the book, and he made a joke about like, at a certain point, we'll like decide we can't lose weight. We're just going to change our beauty standards, say, being fat is attractive. And not that long after, like, the fat acceptance movement came out. And it's, it's ironic that like that, it's just this crazy coincidence that kind of like completely dried up around the time Ozempic came out and you can lose weight without any effort.
Yeah.
But again, like it's just bad incentives, I think, because like, not to dip too deep into the politics side of it, because I also kind of like to talk more broadly about the issues rather than like specific partisan endorsements. But I was at least like, okay, say what you will about RFK Jr., he's talking about these issues, but the actual policies are like, putting like a seed oil executive and, in some of these departments of health is like, well, we now the fast food fries are being fried in beef tallow and we're putting real sugar in Coca-Cola. Problem solved. It's like, well, it's like an aesthetic victory towards a certain type of person. And, all things considered, that's, if it were like at the periphery, that's like, okay, that's a good sign. Like I don't do it all the time, but sometimes I like to have some fast food. French fries are better in beef tallow, and Mexican Coke is delicious. I don't drink soda very often, but I do. When I do, it's a Mexican Coke because, I like the real thing. But that having been said, like it's not ultimately moving the dial. And it does feel like a lot of this stuff is very related, because one of the things that you said that really stuck with me is when you're talking about, some of these women who do XYZ, it's like, oh, well, it's because I remember talking to a woman who I really liked and respected. She was talking about like sex and sexuality and attraction. It's like, well, I want to be desired by men in this way because of the patriarchy. It's like, well, or maybe that's just like you and what you naturally find attractive, and you're externalizing your own desires that you feel maybe uncomfortable with onto an other, like a construct like the patriarchy, or what have you. I see the same thing with like these MRA red pill incel guys, like a similar thing, like, oh, well, women want you to be 6 feet, making all this money. You got to have like a 10-inch dick, et cetera, et cetera. And I can say as like an exceedingly average man who's been around the block more times than you'd think based on who I am as a person. Like, that's not true. You can get a lot of mileage out of just being like, like learning to like work with what you have. But I think, I don't know if it's the online environment or just where our culture has moved towards, where it's I've sometimes called it like, the middle school dance gender dynamics, where like it's just both sexes on either side of the room, like not talking to each other, and like nobody has the balls to go out and just like ask somebody to dance. And I don't know, maybe that's a function of social media or just like the gender degradations that, like, if you shoot your shot, when I was and maybe I sound like a boomer here right now to if I have any younger Zoomer viewers, like, I would shoot my shot and okay, well, I got shot down, maybe I get made fun of, but now that can be on TikTok or the vice versa, or like, some, girl will, is talking to a guy, she sends him some nudes, he shows it to all his friends, and, and that can fuck with her in a lot of different ways. So, I don't know. I do, again, kind of, that's a lot to throw at you. And like, if you had to, like, are you over or under on, like, assuming, we don't go totally tits up and, do like Soviet style collapse, or we're in Mad Max, when you and I are in our 40s and 50s, are you over or under on, like, we just look back at the ubiquity of social media, especially for young people, like we looked at, like, these smoking mothers in the 40s and 50s, or is, Lord God Emperor Elon put the Twitter chip in all of our brain by 2065? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think on some level, it's important to kind of understand where the internet came from, right? Because I think if you were on the internet in like the 2000s or even like early 2010s, like you were very likely an adult, right? Like you were already an adult, like you kind of already understood a little bit about the programming, like you had a certain level of like internet savvy. So I think what's happened is that more and more children are just exposed to the internet at a younger and younger age, because it's become more and more integral to our lives, right? And quite frankly, I just don't see that going away anytime soon, because I mean, again, I hate to keep bringing it up, but it's like, it's something that, Kaczynski brings up in his manifesto, where it's like, what becomes optional on day one becomes mandatory, like, as time goes on, right? And his example was that of the car, where we became increasingly dependent on the car, and like, the cars are not going to go away anytime soon. They might be a little bit different. They might be more fuel efficient in the future, but like now we're kind of a car-based culture. Will we push back against that? Yeah, I mean, I see, certain pockets, cities pushing back against the car. And so I do think that, as time goes on, this is something that Jonathan Haidt has, kind of done a decent amount of good work on, where we're kind of pushing back against the smartphone culture. And so I think, if I had to make like a concrete prediction, I think that there's going to be more of, I guess, government licensing, like basically, because I think right now we're kind of getting the worst of both worlds, where private corporations are trying to implement, age requirements, and they themselves want your government identification, which, if you look at the T app, you look at how that played out, like that's not that's not exactly something that you should trust private companies with. That being said, if I had to kind of put my finger to the wind and sort of see where everything is going, I think that there's going to be more and more enforcement of like actual registration to some degree. I mean, it's not that I endorse this, because I think like this is, again, it's just going to be another example of how bureaucracy kind of encroaches on things that that like, we originally had a freedom for. Like, I mean, I can easily see like people 20 years younger than us, like trying to ask us like, oh, like you could just create a Substack account. Like you didn't even have to give, your license information to the government, like all that kind of stuff. Right. So I think that's kind of where we're going in terms of that. I wanted to circle back to the gender war stuff. I mean,
that was one of the next places I wanted to take this, actually. If you don't mind me asking a framing question, you can just jump into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I often say, like, I can't stand, what it's sometimes called gender slop. I have a couple exceptions. It's Lerpa Strike, friend of the show, Ancient Problems, and you, because I feel like you don't do super partisan stuff. You kind of go like the larger picture, which I appreciate. And it's never been something I've been or at least, something I necessarily want to comment on too much. But I do wonder, like, can we get back to normal? Because just as a framing device, I know you read my most recent article where titled "With Apologies to Francis Fukuyama," where I talked about how I feel like the different factions, be it like political, cultural, ethnic, we're seeing more and more conflict based upon these tribal lines. And in recent years, I think for larger scale reasons that I outlined in that article, but like one of the main core foundational problems that I see are like if people don't have like economic opportunity, they will kind of draw inward on themselves in these tribal groups, and B, if there's not a culture that like is healthy and encourages like two-way assimilation to try to create a larger culture that people feel invested in and they can buy into, like going back to tribal conflicts is kind of inevitable. I'm not one of these like right wing like race war is inevitable. Like I've pretty much always lived in diverse areas, and while it's not always a like wonderful kind of HR approved melting pot, I think people find their own rhythms and dynamics, and that's something that can happen. But without the right conditions, I feel like conflict is going to happen. And that's kind of how I see the gender dynamics right now, because of like the system that exists right now, be it like the online ecosystem, the political, social world, like it's incentivizing tribalization and conflict in ways that like would be alien to a generation before. So all that to say, like, if you want to talk about the gender dynamic stuff, I guess that's my question. Like, can we get back to a better normal dynamic? Or, are we doomed to another generation of gender war?
So I think that it will get better in the long term. I just think that it kind of requires us to go through the valley. And if you put a gun in my head, I would say that, things would probably get worse before they get better. Because I just don't see, like you're saying, the economic opportunity, the loss of culture, the decay of friendship, the decay of like kin networks. And, again, I'm not a super religious guy, but I think, the decay of any sort of moral or religious tradition that people had just kind of as a binding force, like all of these things, I just don't see it trending in the correct direction. Right. And so one of the things that I think is still somewhat disappointing is, and I don't know, maybe you disagree because you kind of maybe occupy a different portion of the internet, is that over the last couple years, it was just kind of openly okay to talk shit about men as a group, like, as a whole, right? And it was just something where we would never really tolerate that in mainstream language for any other group, right? And sort of, it was one of the few times where everyone kind of turns into a libertarian. If you talk about men's issues, it's just like, well, suck it up. You gotta, figure it out, right? We never talk about this for any other group. So just that's again another lane of article that I talk about, right? To the extent that I advocate for men, it's literally just saying like, look, here are some of the problems that men are going through, right? And I still find it disappointing because we're still at the stage where, the gender war is like, oh, maybe not all men are shit. Like maybe, some of them are good, right? Like that's kind of where we're at, where again, it's progress on what I saw beforehand, but it's still nowhere near enough to kind of repair a lot of the damage that has been done. Because I think like what happened was with a guy like Andrew Tate and all the manosphere stuff, I mean, obviously that was kind of bad in the opposite direction. And that went mainstream, that kind of went viral. But, they weren't occupying places like the New York Times, right? They weren't writing New York Times columns. They weren't, going on CNBC and all that stuff. It was a very like TikTok social media trend. Whereas like in the opposite direction, from, women writing think pieces about men, it's still very much mainstream to kind of have this sneering attitude, almost like a denigrating attitude, right? So in that sense, I do see it kind of, I have some optimism because I think it is getting better. Like I think like now people like Richard Reeves, people like Scott Galloway, to an extent, like, some of these other left-leaning figures, they're able to talk about these issues without immediately getting shouted down. I just think the only reason that's happening is because they lost every single swing state in the election, and they realized like, oh, we're losing men to the Republicans. They're not coming out to watch our movies. They're not buying our video games. They're not showing up to university anymore. And so like, you're just seeing them disappear, right? So I'm kind of skeptical in the sense where I think a lot of the advocacy is just due to the naked self-interest of, oh, we're kind of losing half of our consumer base. And, you know, they just want men back just so they can like mindlessly consume our products. I could be wrong. Like there could just be like a general interest, but, you know, it's hard to say, because the thing that I see is that, you know, if and when the Democrats take power back in 2028, is it going to, like, is that rhetoric still going to be there, or are they just going to drop it the moment, you know, they take back power? And I think this kind of relates to kind of some of the two most recent articles that I wrote, which is like my frustration between all this rhetoric that's out there. Like, because if you look online, like, you'll see a bunch of takes, you'll see a bunch of opinions, you'll see people talking about things, but I always try to tie it back to like what the average person can see, right? Like, yes, there is like an abundance agenda, but right now it's just in the rhetoric stage. And now what I see, especially with the masculinity stuff, is something that I'm calling like masculinity peddling, where it's like, oh, you know what a real man is? It's someone who votes Democrat. You know what a real man is? It's someone who sits back and kind of, you know, lets the women take charge, right? A real man. And it's just kind of like using the language of masculinity to kind of traffic the opinions that they've always had in the first place. They're just kind of using a little bit more of like bro culture, right? So it's just this pervasive, I don't want to say frustration, but like this discrepancy that I keep seeing with all these think pieces and all these writers and stuff that we're actually seeing on the ground, because that stuff is not going to go away. Like, there's like, again, there's a lot of tragedies that have been happening lately. And I think the baseline issue is that they're just men who've been alienated. They're terminally online men who've been alienated, and that's not going to go away anytime soon, right? So again, to answer your question, I think it will get better, but I think it only gets better when people see how much worse it can get.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I honestly don't even necessarily see that as a bad thing. Just because, like, I don't think anybody, because I think there's like this, what'd you say, like false consciousness of, it's at least in the US, like I mean, I don't know when you want to pinpoint the start or beginning, but at least within my lifetime, a lot of politics has been about moral posturing, where I think like historically, and I think the most effective political or social movements have spoke to, I guess, you know, if you want to use like the Marxist terminology, material conditions, like people's real fucking life, essentially. And if you want to use that, like, you know, rationalist input output brain, like, okay, you have X problem, you need to solve it. I've talked to a couple different people on this subject, and I think whoever can offer a vision of normalcy is going to own the future. Right now, to me, I don't strongly see either pole of where our politics are culturally, or even like what material conditions they're willing to deal with or acknowledge. I don't see in a short term anybody really dealing with that. Maybe inklings here or there, but I do think that like whoever can offer, be it on the gender issue, culture, whatever, somebody who can offer something that is more than just identity politics, and I include Republicans, and I think that's been kind of I think you kind of like much in the same way that like I think the Democrats and liberals became more like conservatives to try to win in the context of like cable news stuff. I think the Democrats, or rather the Republicans and the conservatives, have become more like the Democrats in the fact that they've more or less doubled down on identity politics and shift. At least that's what I've seen in my life, shifting from we are the default, this is like the default type of American, to the, you know, either if you see it as like, you know, call it heritage Americans, you know, white Christian conservative. And I think it's a lot more inclusive than that, but a certain ideology or worldview as being the default to this is another interest group now. Which is all that to say, like, I don't see that being a good thing long term. Maybe it's an important phase in development, much like I know I have some friends on the right who really will malign identity politics or feminism, what have you, but like these weren't like arbitrary things that people came up with to, just purely to cynically gain power. It was speaking to a real problem. And I think much in the same way we're seeing like with young men or young people in general right now, it's speaking to a real problem. And maybe as of now, it has been something that's been experienced more acutely by men, but it's an unfortunate thing to say. And I know some people who, much like I see, feminists like, oh, well, you only care about this issue, like reproductive rights when it affects men, et cetera. Like much in the same way I see like, well, you're only starting to care about the loneliness epidemic when it's starting to affect women. And I get that impetus, and it can be frustrating. That having been said, like the important part is that this problem is being acknowledged and trying to address it. So I do, at the very least, I'm hoping, I don't know what's actually going to happen, that I don't know who's going to be worse off in 2028. I don't know if politics is downstream of culture or culture is downstream of politics, but like, I don't know who's going to be worse off, like MAGA without woke or Democrats without Trump. Because I feel like, at least I hope, like, okay, this is a point where we can maybe look at things a little bit more broadly. It's not about single personalities. The shibboleth of each side has retreated, or at the very least, it's been, at that point, it'll be like 15, maybe closer to 20 years, depending on how you want to look at its start. Like, I feel like people are getting tired of this conversation, and hopefully we can have some kind of like larger cultural conversation and find something that's a little bit more universal, if not religion, like something to have aspiring. Like I'm working on something right now. Should probably be out right now about like, maybe the need to reassert some kind of civic nationalism or some sort of larger project. But what it's going to look like, I don't know. But maybe that's a moving in the right direction. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. So, do you know what a hyperparameter is?
I've heard the term. What does it mean?
Yeah. So basically, it's it's funny. I'm shitting on these rationalist guys for using technical jargon, and now I'm going to do the same thing. But I think it's a useful framing to kind of how I think about a lot of these issues. And so, if you're trying to, let's just say, create like a machine learning model, basically what you're trying to do is take some inputs and use a little bit of math, and then make a prediction about the future. So a very simple example is like, let's just say you had a bunch of housing information. So you know about like the number of rooms it has, like where it's located, how old it is, all that kind of stuff. Those would be the inputs. You throw it in a machine learning model, and then it kind of spits out, kind of makes a prediction on like how much that house is supposed to cost, right? So when you train up your model, it gets better at making predictions about the housing prices, right? And so you can, apply that to a whole bunch of different scenarios. Now, when it creates the model, it uses these things called parameters, right? So basically it's like, it'll use the number of rooms and like the location, all these things. These are kind of like the baseline parameters that it uses to make the predictions, right? But no matter, like, if you don't tune these things called hyperparameters, then it doesn't matter how good your model is, it'll never make the correct predictions, right? And so the parameters are kind of like the features of your model, and the hyperparameters is telling them how to train the model in the first place, right? Maybe giving a slightly simpler example is like, let's just take like the parameters of your schooling are the subjects that you take, but the hyperparameters is like the quality of the teachers, how much time you spend. They're not things that are directly related to the school, but they kind of influence the actual school environment. I bring this up because, again, like, not to sound like an enlightened centrist, but I don't generally take a political spectrum stance on it, because I think a lot of the issues are not due to the parameters of society. It's not a left-right spectrum. It's not Marxism versus libertarianism versus whatever ism you care about. It has to do with these things called hyperparameters of society. So I think one example is kind of like, the retirement age, right? So like, I think right now, one of the biggest problems with our government is the fact that, at the highest levels of office, we have people with functionally decaying brains, like people who are literally too old to like do physical tasks, basically telling us how the nation is going to run, right? So this is not a left-wing thing. This is not a right-wing thing. Again, whoever is the person who has the balls to call this out and say, look, we need to implement a retirement age, like, I will support them, right? I don't care if they're a Republican. I don't care if they're a Democrat, right? Like, it's just a simple fact that you can't have people who are born like around World War II trying to understand, the intricacies of a large language model. It's just, that's, after a certain point, you're just too old to kind of keep up with the pace of life. It's nothing against them. It's just, that's, you look at their brains and you're going to see some plaque there, right? So I think that's kind of a hyper parameter, where it's not what laws need to be passed, but it's about what, how you're going to structure your government to figure out what laws should be passed, right? So again, I just think that if you had people who are a little bit younger, in their 50s and 60s, instead of like, some people are like in their late 80s and 90s, I think that that would solve a lot of these problems. So the point I'm trying to make here is that I think there's a lot of hyper parameters that are not being addressed. Nobody is talking about these things. Same thing, like, I think obesity is a hyper parameter of society, where, again, I don't care who takes up this issue, but you can't have a healthy society when you have people in it who are just quite literally unhealthy, right? Like, people who just cannot, like, they need like scooters and stuff to walk, and again, like drinking literal sugar water directly into their bloodstream, right? That is something where, if you're left wing, right wing, don't care, like, someone needs to fix it. Another one is, I think, like the student debt, where the fact that it's somehow treated differently than all other forms of debt, in that you cannot discharge it. I think that's like, I think that if you solve that one issue, it's going to create a cascade of changes, that, like, it'll, because it completely changes the incentives. Like you're talking about, the incentives of inside of the society are completely messed up right now, right? And so in my head, I'm always trying to think about what are the things that actually are going to fundamentally change the incentives. On that front, I don't know. I'm a little bit pessimistic, because it seems like very few people are even thinking along those lines. They still are under the impression where it's like, look, my side of the aisle are the good guys, and their side of the aisle is clearly the bad guys. And so, like, they're kind of LARPing in like this heroes versus villains narrative. And it still feels like very childish. It still feels very it's very like middle school, and like you're saying, like with the whole men versus women thing, like, I know I go hard in the paint against women, but I think it's just kind of like, a lot of times, and maybe I should take some time to clear this up, where a lot of my criticisms are not necessarily targeted towards academic feminists, because I read a lot of their literature, and that was actually one of the first 4 or 5 posts that I was making on my blog, right? Where if you read the stuff that comes out of the academic departments, it's very boring. It's very bland. It's like, the discrepancies between male and female domestic work in Britain in 1800s, right? Like, it's just kind of, they're making a very specific point about a very specific time. And most of the time they're kind of directing criticisms at each other, right? It's kind of interesting. It's like a parallel Substack thing, where it's like, well, this feminist is not taking into account this thing. And like, it's very directed. It's very boring.
Yeah, it's funny. My wife calls it It's not. It's related to like the very academic side. She calls it "pick up your socks" feminism, which is like that early 2010s brand of like Jezebel feminism, where literally like a woman, like her husband didn't pick up his socks, and instead of saying, "Hey, sweetie, can you make sure you pick up your socks?" she writes an article about it, about how your personal domestic problems are actually symbolic of something much larger. So instead of dealing with the uncomfortable social situation of like maybe having a hard conversation with your spouse or a coworker, it's like, oh, this is a much larger societal problem that needs to be solved by whatever. Which to be fair, we're doing a lot of that too. So I think that's we're all merely fish, and that's the water that we swim in. But
Yeah.
I do think it's I don't know if this is black pilling or white pilling, to use the internet parlance, but I do feel like the system is not going to resolve itself. The purpose of system is what it does, as as we like to say in some of these spaces. But for better or for worse, I do think there's not a lot of gas left in this tank. I mean, I've been, vocally critical of, or the outgoing administration or the incoming one. And I think, like you said, I don't think it's any mistake that, we have elected the two oldest presidents to ever hold office who have like, various degrees of pudding brain at this point. And I think that a lot of these framings just don't really track to a lot of people who aren't in that like older Cold War mindset. Be it like some of this, like I sometimes call it like the eternal Reagan administration of the liberal mind, or like the 1968 brain, where people think on the left that like we're still living in these gender and racial dynamics of a generation or maybe two before. And which isn't to say like I have some people on the right who's like, it's this anti-white, anti-Christian, anti-male. It's like there's granularity to both of those things. They both exist simultaneous with each other and interlocking with each other. Like the idea that there is one single power structure or one single social structure, at least in the United States, because that's where I live and that's what I know and can write about. I can't speak to Europe or Asia, and with any degree of other than just like me having read books or articles and trying to fire off. But kind of in the same way that like I see people still talking about like communism versus capitalism, or democracy versus the dictatorships, as if like these are still conversations that are being had, or if that's still the paradigm in 2025. Like I think the system is like, I don't know how much more time it has in it, but it feels like, maybe me being optimistic, like 2028, like if you want to use presidential elections as a barometer, like I maybe we'll have one more repeat of, MAGA versus woke essentially, but I feel like that's at the periphery. You see some people really doubling down on it, but I think, maybe a long-winded answer, and I'll throw it back to you. But much in the same way that people were talking about the vibe shift when Trump was reelected, or now I'm seeing some people say similar things about what's his face, Zoran Mamdani in New York. I think we're just in a very like thermostatic place culturally and politically, and just so many people who and either swung for Trump, or people who swung for Mamdani who normally wouldn't have, like, or the same thing with like Obama back in the day. Like people just like are saying like this is not working, and we need to try something else politically, culturally, with so many aspects of our society. Like maybe the bright side is like I don't know if you follow Ken Clipperstein, and it feels like every week he's posting about like some 87-year-old senator who's functionally brain dead and in these sessions of Senate or Congress, who like have an aide who's having them like read off their prepared statements and clearly don't know what they're talking about. Like it's some kind of like geriatric hostage situation, or people just like straight up dying in office. I feel like it's gonna, material conditions and just like the external forces and just people fucking dying is going to necessitate and facilitate change. What that's going to look like, TBD. I would very much not like there to be, and I know people talk about like, revolution and stuff, especially these days. Like, but I'm no historian by any means, but I'm a history buff and I read a lot about it. When you read about these revolutionary conditions, either like, the fall of Tsarist Russia and like the red and white terrors to the fall of the Soviet Union and, the horrors that happened then, or communist China, whatever, like this is not a good thing, guys. Like we still have a lot. I think there are some people who are really doomers about America and the West. Like we have problems, but we still do have a lot of good things going for us. There's still a lot to work with. And which isn't to say it can't go tits up. It very much can, but I don't want to live through like a red terror or like, maybe I don't think we're there, but like something like, after the fall of the Soviet Union where, the federal government has collapsed and, people are just, selling their goods or, in some cases, even their bodies just to like get by. Like, let's try to avoid that if possible. So I don't know. I don't know what it's going to look like. I think we have maybe a better chance than most, but hopefully it'll be if not a smooth transition, like, one that's not devastating.
Yeah. The people who are talking about revolution, I think that the vast majority of them are just kind of like LARPing online, because I always wonder with a lot of these people, like how much of them have like martial arts training? Have any of them like been punched in the face? Have any of them, and this isn't like a comedic point. I'm genuinely like, because the thing is like, if you go to some of these gyms, like you will find a 16-year-old boy who can, and if you invite them to, will beat the shit out of you. And there is nothing you can do about it. It doesn't matter what your politics are, all that stuff. So I'm always hesitant for the people who, because I know a bunch of people who can, they are functionally murderers, like they are like fighters. They can kill people, right? I don't think they've actually killed people, but it's like, you see them at these gyms and they do not want violence, right? They don't act like this. They're not like, once you know that you can beat the crap out of 99% of the population, there is no, they don't talk about how, they're going to go out onto the streets and all that stuff. Like they're just, and 20% calmer than everyone else because they know how to handle themselves, but they don't use this sort of like rhetoric. So I think with these revolutionaries online, I just can't help but wonder, guys, like you should probably go to a mixed martial arts gym for about 3 or 4 months before you think in these terms, right? Because if you actually understand violence and you understand like how helpless you can be in the face of another violent person, I just don't think, like you would still court violence the same way that these people are doing, right? That being said, I'm not going to lecture people online. I'm not going to like, sit there and put out some sort of HR approved statement being like, guys, we need to calm down, all that stuff, right? Like, I understand this is how social media works. So I'm just happy to let people say what they want to say and then potentially, have a little FAFO moment. I think, coming back to your point about like the whole politics stuff, I don't know about you, but I think one of the black pilling moments for me was around 2016, where, if you remember, the original race was supposed to be between Bush versus Clinton. And it was just one of those things where I'm like, wait a minute, we had Bush versus Clinton in 2000. And now we're kind of circling right back to the same thing. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, this is it. Like we decided to establish a new country to get away from monarchies. And here we are kind of establishing our own monarchies. Like it's obviously not just one family, but it's like we're just kind of cycling and alternating through the same small group of people. And I refuse to believe that in a functioning democracy, these are the people that would, kind of be at the top of the hill. And I think it speaks to something that I think you're also kind of attuned to, which is this idea that, I think 2008 was a moment. I think COVID was another moment where people feel fundamentally rug pulled, where like not just financially, but like in their psychology, where it's like you had a vision of your life, you had a vision of America, and that vision was just kind of rug pulled from underneath you. And I think it's something that I don't think we're still appreciating, like especially from a COVID perspective, where people have legitimately soured on the American experience, right? And this is something that I really feel that, like, again, I have my gripes with the right, but I think the left is just far more out of touch with this, because I feel like a lot of times, like a lot of these pundits, they go, well, why are they acting this way? Why do they kind of want this change? Why are they, if the world is kind of like an etch-a-sketch board, like why do they just want to shake things up and kind of throw the bull into the china shop? And it's like, yeah, it's easy for you to say because things worked out for you, right? Like they went to the schools, they got the good grades, they got the good jobs with the high status. And it's like they played by the rules and everything kind of worked out. And I think that for a lot of other people, they were kind of abiding by the same rules, and things did not work out for them, right? It wasn't a matter of intelligence. It wasn't a matter of discipline or willpower. It was just, they just got dealt a shit hand. And because of all of these geopolitical factors, they're now in a much worse position than they were, right? Not just financially, but like kind of psychologically. And so I don't know if you're like a Warhammer guy. Like, do you know about the lore?
I know about the lore, and I'll put it this way: like, I would really like to get into Warhammer, but I already have enough expensive hobbies and time-consuming fandoms. I'm an aspirational Warhammer fan. I'll put it that way. I think the lore is really cool.
Yeah. I mean, that's just the one point that I was going to make, because I don't want to get into like social contract theory. So I just want to use like an abstraction where I think when people feel rug pulled, like to their bones, I think there's more and more people that just kind of fall to the gods of chaos, if that makes sense. Like they just want things to change. They don't care if it's left wing. They don't care if it's right wing. Like it's just a pervasive nihilism that kind of, informs their worldview. Everything is kind of like, it's crazy. I go on YouTube and I'm like learning about, these shootings from like a channel called Lessons in Meme Culture, right? Because it's like they're turning everything into memes. They're turning, that like all of a sudden, they'll turn like these actual tragedies into like dank memes and all that stuff. And it's just this pervasive sense of like nothing matters. And I think on some level, obviously looking at it from my perspective, it's horrifying. It's kind of repulsive, but I think like, some of the experiences in my own life, I don't empathize, but I can see how you get there. I can see how, if you've just felt alienated, abandoned, and just left completely alone for enough time, you just realize like, oh, I don't matter. Like I'm not a part of this project that we call America. So why does it matter whether I like left, right, all this stuff? Like, who cares? Like, just bring on the chaos, right? And then I guess one last point that you made previously is kind of this, like the dichotomies that we have right now just aren't doing anything to, they don't really describe the current moment. And I'm reading an interesting book called Why Liberalism Failed. And it's liberalism.
I just read it. Yep.
Oh yeah, right on. And I'm on the chapter with the relationship between like liberty and statism, right? And I thought that was very revelatory, because this idea, and the way that I kind of conceptualize it, is that, we've kind of made optionality our religion, right? Like the idea that we should just be able to do whatever we want at the individual level. That's kind of like our highest value as an American. And what that actually entails is an ever expansive bureaucracy, because that bureaucracy has to, kind of come in and enforce that we have as many options available, right? And so in that sense, it was very clarifying to me, because a lot of these crises, like the friendship crisis, the fertility crisis, all of these crises, they're crises of commitment, right? Because the opposite of optionality is just committing to a path. Having a baby, limits the number of things that you can do with the rest of your life. Having a deep friendship is an obligation. It's a limiting thing. Having a partner is a limiting thing. So what you see is that, when you worship optionality over everything else, all of these other things go by the wayside. So it was almost kind of like a beautiful lens to see everything through, because there's a common thread between a lot of the ailments. In terms of where this all plays out, it's definitely tough, man. I think I think the obesity crisis is kind of like a leading indicator, because, and I mentioned this with ancient problems, it's one of those things where it's like, look, if you're 500 pounds and 28 years old, by the time you're 38, that problem solves itself one way or the other, right? Like you either don't make it or you figure something out. And again, I apologize for saying it so crudely, but it is the truth of how these things work. And I think it's the same thing with the gender war, where it's like you can only have so much hatred towards the opposite sex before like you're just going to be 55 or 60 and like there's no one around, like no man or woman wants to date you. So you either figure it out and kind of adjust your attitude, or you just, get some cats.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's it's a really smart way of putting it. And I'm not necessarily a fan of Thomas Sowell. I've never really read any of his stuff, and I know people feel all kinds of ways about him, but I do really like the quote I heard from him. Like, there's no such thing as solutions, only trade-offs. And I think that's the reality of we're going to have to start accepting trade-offs in a lot of different ways, because that was one of my takes from why liberalism failed, is it just like broadly speaking, looking at the flaws of liberalism, and I made like capital L liberalism, not like, gay marriage and Whole Foods liberalism, is, that was kind of the fundamental flaw of like that post-war consensus. Like the liberal world order is like things will get better all the time forever, or the system doesn't work. And I think we're just going to have to, we've been coping essentially that like, that's going to be the case. And at least within my lifetime, especially post like 2008, that's not been the case. And we're just going, like, we're going to have these conditions forced upon us as a society, and how we meet them is going to be kind of make or break. If, we can, I'm talking about the United States specifically, again, because that's where I live. If we can rise to that occasion as we have as a nation, several times in the past, or is this like, our Soviet Union moment where it's just like kind of eternal decline, not even like as far as like national prosperity goes, just like everybody's individual conditions, the culture, etc. But I guess I think we're getting a little over 2 hours now, so I'll probably start winding down. Do you have any closing thoughts on any of this before we jump into the last couple things?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, we're recording this at a time where, things are definitely heated in a political moment. There's a lot of, I'm seeing a lot of rhetoric that's very maximalist, stuff that, quite frankly, I see that's a little bit discouraging on both sides. And what's I find very, kind of discouraging is that, if you go to one ecosystem, I'll call it like the Reddit/Blue Sky ecosystem, you live in one world. If you live in at least my corner of Substack and, kind of the X ecosystem, it's almost like a completely different world, right? And so I think that, for the time being, there might be some time in the future where all of this becomes healthier in the online landscape, but genuinely, like, if you're online, like you just got to get off, man. Like I think like go outside, go touch grass, go for a jog, do all these things that, these fitness optimizers tell you to do, like get your vitamin D. I know it's a very fucking boring thing to say, but like, this is how you actually find some step to prosperity in your own life. And listen, I'm not going to sit here and lecture people from a holier than thou perspective. I fail at this all the time. Like it's not something that I'm saying that I have mastered myself. But I really think that, for anyone out there, like there's nothing online right now that's going to make you a better person. Like really, like very few things, right? I mean, I'm sure there's someone out there who's, just going to obscure mathematics blogs and kind of learning some new theorems or whatever. But like for the vast majority of people, it just makes you a worse and more bitter person. So for all those listening, that's kind of my call to action. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. That's on my side.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. Maybe what we need is a rationality influencer who can find like just the right language to talk about, maximizing your solar exposure, and bio whatever, find a fancy way to say touch grass, log off. Occasionally the boomer pill is correct. Maybe you should just grill with some friends. If you have family friends, spend time with them. Even if you don't have kids, like I don't have kids at the moment. My little sister just had her first kid. It was last weekend. We had like the last barbecue of the summer, and I just spent time with friends. We did grill. We did the boomer centrist thing, and grilling nationalism is maybe the way forward. I did that. Looked at my little nephew. It's like, a lot of this online politics stuff is kind of stupid and fake. It is maybe good to just sometimes you do have to take the boomer pill and touch grass. So that having been said, Rohan, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been a lot of fun. We'll have to do something again sometime, because I feel like we could we could probably yap for another 2 hours, but let's keep it in digestible chunks for the lovely viewing audience at home. But Rohan, do you want to do any plugs, promotions, just like your general where to find you, all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I just have the one newsletter. I'm sure you'll probably link it in the post itself. So if you want to read that, the newsletter is called Brackish Waters, Barren Soil. Just the Substack page is kind of where I have everything. And yeah, no, I agree with you. I enjoyed this a lot. I love having these sorts of conversations with like people like yourself. And as always, I enjoy so much, reading the next thing that you're going to be putting out there.
Oh, well, thanks so much, man. Likewise. Well, I always ask the same question to end the podcast on, since we were both doom and gloom and hopeful. But like, what's something that does make you feel hopeful, or some kind of like something you're looking forward to the future? Like, what do you say? Like, what are you bullish on, so to speak, to use the financial terms?
Every morning I wake up with a dog's nose pressing into the side of my face, and it never gets old. Like, I love, petting my dog and then seeing her face, and kind of taking her out on walks and getting fresh air. It's all the little things, right? Not to dive into a story at the very end of the podcast, but, I've kind of had things, kind of taken away from me. I've had, had to deal with some very difficult things, like especially in the last few years. And I've just kind of come to appreciate, all those small things. Playing with the dog every morning, I kind of go up and talk to the lady at the bakery. They're about only 500 yards away. So I just kind of walk over there, and I enjoy my cup of coffee every single morning. It never stops getting old for me. And same thing, like, today I'm going to do a workout, and it's hard to describe. Like, I always like that feeling of kind of putting my, fingers around the bar and kind of feeling the steel, and then kind of getting that feeling of like lifting heavy shit around every single day. It never gets old. So it's all these little things that I look forward to. And late at night, I love, kind of turning on my laptop and opening a blank Google document and just kind of writing the things that are on my mind. I'm working on this short story, and I'm trying to get it working, trying to get the characters, up to snuff and all that. And I just enjoy every aspect of the process. I like the revision, I like the edits, all that. So to answer your question, it's all those little things that keep me sane for all the stuff that's kind of going online. It keeps me grounded.
Well, Rohan, I think that's a really beautiful sentiment, and I appreciate you coming on. I'll do it again.
Cheers, Prester. Have a good one.